Okay, so welcome to this session on your child's school attendance and exclusion rights. We can see there's been a great amount of people wanting to join this session, so hopefully it's going to be helpful to you all. We're delighted you're all joining us. My name is Hannah and I'm a Senior Advice and Information Officer at Inquire. I've worked at Inquire for almost over 6 years now. Before that, I worked in education policy at the Scottish Government, and then with young adults with learning difficulties. And before that, I was a child with additional support needs who did most of my exams and spent a lot of time in hospitals. So actually school attendance is a subject quite close to my own heart. I'm joined, not as our presentation said, by my colleague Sharon, but I've got my colleague Beth here who will introduce herself.
Hi everybody, my name's Beth. I am replacing Sharon for the evening, but me and Sharon actually both do the same job. I am an advice and information officer, so I work on our helpline and answer inquiries. I've been with Inquire for over a year now. Before that, I used to work in high schools supporting children with additional support needs. Glad to be here, glad to help. Back to you, Hannah.
Thank you, Beth. So firstly, I'm just going to do a very brief introduction to Inquire, just in case you haven't heard of us, but hopefully you have. So we're the Scottish Advice Service for Additional Support for Learning. We've existed since 1999 and we're funded by the Scottish Government to provide independent advice and information to children, young people, parents, carers and professionals about children's rights and the legislation and guidance related to additional support for learning. So that includes things like your rights as a parent or carer, what your child's rights to support for learning are, and how to work together with the school. As it says, our vision is that all children in Scotland are supported, included, and listened to throughout their education. Now, we offer this through our helpline, which you can access from phone, email, web chat. And we also have our parents and carers information, guides, fact sheets, quick read. We also have a website that we recently rewrote. Well, Beth was very involved in doing a massive rewrite of our website, and we have a young people's website, reach.scot. And we also do sessions like this on outreach to specific groups or on specific subjects. And we also have quite a big social media presence to keep you up to date on things like this event and other things going on. Now, we do this all with the goal of helping you feel more listened to, supported, to feel more confident, to take action, to understand your rights and your child's rights, and your local authorities' responsibilities and your school's responsibilities. Our goal is also to make sure that you feel you know what steps to take and where to go to find out more information and help. Now, the aim of this session is that I'm going to very briefly summarise the main laws around school attendance and exclusion and cover how these relate to children with additional support for learning needs. We're going to talk about how you can work with school and what to do to resolve any issues that come up. And we'll also answer some of your questions about your particular circumstances. Now, any of you who've been to our sessions before, we've previously put quite a lot of information up front, but we've decided this from feedback and kind of the way we've been reflecting on our sessions to try out a bit of a different format where we're going to have less information about the law up front, but we're going to focus more on your questions and the frequently asked questions about this subject. So hopefully that's a kind of helpful look. So we're going to shortly ask you to submit some of your own questions so that we can answer these in the Q&A, but we'll also do an FAQ, frequently asked questions, where we'll cover the main issues that we hear on the helpline. So this will include part-time timetables, being asked to pick your child up from the school regularly, exclusions and school refusal or anxiety-related absence. So hopefully we can cover as many of your questions and you can all get as much as possible from this. Now, firstly, although I'm going to cover some of the key facts first, but for those who are watching online and live, feel free to start putting your questions in the chat. This will give us a chance, Beth, chance to see them and make sure we cover as many as possible. You can just pop these in the chat. Ideally, if you can pop them to the whole group rather than directly to one of us, because sometimes we don't see them with all the chat coming in. And just to make sure you're not kind of naming individual schools, that would be great. So you can start thinking about your questions while I'm going to do a very quick run. Oh, if my computer will let me. Yes, through very briefly through the additional support for learning duties and then attendance and exclusions. So very briefly, just so that we're all on the same page, the very basic duties around additional support needs and disability duties are that, firstly, we all know what we mean when we say additional support needs. So your child has additional support needs if for whatever reason they can't benefit from school education without extra help. So this means that there's a really broad definition of what it means for a child to have additional support need. It's whatever is a barrier to their learning that they need additional support additional support with, means they have additional support needs. So the key thing about that is also that your child does not need a diagnosis to be entitled to support. So anything that's impacting them can be considered an additional support need if they need support at school to help them with that. So that can include a young person being a young carer, might include a child who has a learning difficulty. It might be that a child is struggling to attend and no one's sure why they're struggling to attend, but there's a barrier. They're all considered within that remit of additional support needs. And the main key thing to know is that for children with additional support needs, your local authority, so your council, through your school, has a duty to offer your child adequate and efficient provision to support them so that they can benefit from their learning. So what that means is the law doesn't say exactly what support should look like, but it should be adequate and efficient and directed toward your child achieving their fullest potential. And we'll talk about a bit more about what that means when it comes to these issues around exclusion and attendance. And there's lots more on that one. There's a whole section on our website that my colleague, who I apologise I forgot to mention earlier, who's online, Mohit, in the background from our comms team, he'll be sharing those links. So there's a great section on our website on understanding your child's additional support needs and their rights that he will link to. So as well as additional support needs, the other thing that we mention quite a lot about, in particularly when we're talking about attendance and exclusion, is disabilities duties. So there is the Additional Support for Learning Act and Additional Support for Learning laws, which are quite broad, as I said. So they cover any child who needs additional support for whatever reason. Now, also what's relevant is the Equality Act, which covers the definition of disabled children. So a child is disabled if they have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on their ability to carry out normal daily activities. I know that's a lot to take on, but basically, so there is a quite set definition around what a disabled child is, but not what a disabled child is, but if a child is disabled under equality law, it's not a full list of conditions that qualify as a child having a disability. It's about how it affects them in their life. That's the relevant factor in that. So what we kind of say is, with disability, the focus should not be on the effect of the impairment on a person's life, or it should be the focus on the effect of the impairment on a person's life, not the type of impairment. So it's just about thinking about whether your child has something that's a long-term, something that has a long-term substantial impact on their daily life. When we're talking about disability, there is places you can go for advice that we'll talk about later, that would be able to advise if your child might be considered disabled. But it's just important to know there's a wee bit of a difference in the definition of additional support needs and disability, but both kind of talk to each other. And the important thing to know is, if your child is disabled, then schools, nurseries and local authorities must protect disabled pupils from discrimination and work towards increasing equality of opportunity. And part of that is that they must make reasonable adjustments. So they must avoid treating your child unfairly or putting them at a disadvantage compared to other children and young people, which is particularly relevant when we start talking about exclusions and attendance. Right, so we've got that kind of understanding of additional support needs and disability, and now we kind of get onto the main subject of what we've been talking about here, which is that school attendance. So the first thing to know with school attendance is that the law says that parents have a duty to provide their child with an education, and most parents do that by sending their child to their local authority school or asking their local authority to be responsible for their child's education. You do have other options like home education and independent schooling, but most families kind of complete that by sending their child to their local authority school. Now, when that happens, then the act that I mentioned before about the local authority being responsible for your child's individual needs and making sure they get that support comes into play. So what that means is that although you have that responsibility to make sure your child's getting to school, if they have things that are causing them challenges and is making it difficult for them to attend, then your local authority in school has a duty to be supporting that additional support need and finding a way to make sure that they can attend school. And part of that is if they can't attend school, then they still have a right to an education if they are unwell, unable to attend, or there's another barrier. So there's a duty to educate your child if they're enrolled in a local authority school, and if they're struggling, there's a duty to still be educating them and working out a way to get the right support in place. Now, we're going to talk through in the kind of specific questions what that support might look like, but the kind of important initial things to know are that there is that duty if your child's unable to attend, but also because you have a duty to be educating your child, it's really important that you're keeping in touch with the local authority about why your child's not attending, if you're concerned about their support, so that it's clear that you're taking that effort as well as parents to make sure that you're completing your duty to educate your child. Now, the other thing that we hear quite a lot about around school attendance is part-time timetables, which again we'll get a bit more into in the questions. But the first thing to know about this is that the law doesn't set out a specific number of hours of education. So this is kind of, it's more assumed by the fact that every other child is getting a full-time education, but there isn't a set number, so that doesn't set out anywhere in the law exactly how many hours your child's entitled to, but they have that right to support, and they have, as we mentioned with equality duties, most children should be attending the same as their peers for as much time as they're able to, and there's an equality element there. But although it doesn't set out, so that's where we sometimes hear about part-time timetables. And the key thing around part-time timetables is we can kind of assume that your child's entitled to go to school full-time, but if they are struggling, in some cases, a part-time timetable might be used, but what we always advise is that part-time timetables should be a last resort, or they should be for as short a time as possible and in a child's best interests. What a part-time timetable shouldn't be used as a long-term way of meeting your child's needs. It should be about your what's right for your child, and as a way, perhaps, if they're returning from an exclusion, or if they've been unwell and they're being reintroduced into school, but it shouldn't be a way of managing your child's needs. So Beth will go into that a bit longer, in a bit more detail in the Q&A, no doubt, but those are kind of the main things to know around that, and we cover quite a lot of this in our web pages as well. I'm going to grab a bit of water because I've been talking for a while. Is there anything more you want to add on that one, Beth, just before I go on to exclusions?
No, I think you covered that quite well, and we've got tons of questions coming in, so thanks everybody. I'll just say it now while I remember. I am taking note of all the questions that we've got. Some of them are kind of similar, so I'm going to try and clump some together so that we can answer them. So hopefully we'll get through all the questions. Hopefully we'll answer a lot of questions that might relate to your question anyway, if we don't get to yours specifically. But thanks for already getting loads in. We are good to go after we finished the last few slides from Hannah.
Super. I will quickly get through this last one, and then we can get on to the questions. I can see them popping up. But yes, so we can get more into attendance and part-time timetables. So the other subject we wanted to cover was exclusion. So as I mentioned before, this is something that we hear about quite regularly on the helpline. It's sometimes also called suspension. We get inquiries, but basically an exclusion is when your school, your child's school, sends your child home and doesn't allow them to return for a certain number of days. The really important thing about exclusions is that they're a really serious step and should be a last resort, and when there is no suitable alternative. There's also only 2 circumstances when a school can exclude a pupil. So that's when they think the order and discipline in the school and the education of other pupils will be badly affected if your child continues to attend, or when the school thinks that a pupil's parents or the young person, if they're over 16, did not follow the school rules, or the parent has allowed their child to break the school rules. So there's only those 2 specific circumstances where your child can be excluded, and the school have to set them out. So they're the grounds for exclusion. Even if they do feel these apply, then it should still be a last resort to exclude a child. So the school should also always start by considering your child's individual needs, the impact this is going to have on them, and their whole well-being. And there's a really helpful, I'm sure Beth will mention it later, and I think Mohit's got a link. There's actually, within the Scottish Government guidance, there's a checklist for schools that advises things to think about before they exclude, and it's kind of summarised as well in our exclusion fact sheet. But the important thing to be aware of is that they do have to consider significantly what they could do before excluding your child, and thinking about that long-term impact and your child's whole well-being. There's also, because exclusions are part of the law, there's a very specific procedure that must be followed when your child's excluded. So this means that they have to start by contacting you on the day to tell you that your child's been excluded. They have to arrange a meeting with you within 7 days to discuss the exclusion, and they have to write to you within 8 days to tell you why your child was excluded. That reason, the ground of the exclusion, any conditions that need to be met for your child to return, and about the right to appeal the exclusion, which is also something that's really important to be aware of. Now, the important thing about these procedures is there's very set things that have to be done, and they need to be followed. So if the rules aren't followed, or if perhaps you're being asked to pick your child up and you're not given a letter, a grounds of exclusion, then this could be called an unlawful exclusion. And I think we're going to talk about that more in the frequently asked questions, but it's important to be aware that really, if your child is being sent home, unless they're unwell and there's a very kind of tangible reason, they should be being excluded in a sense, because there is formal rights that come with that, and there is things that have to be followed, and it gives you and your child that right to appeal. Now, we'll probably go on to discuss this more as well, but we often get questions around, can a disabled child or a child with additional support needs be excluded? In short, the answer is yes, your child can still be excluded. The same rules still apply, but schools and local authorities have to be very careful about making that decision, because they need to make sure they're not excluding your child on the basis of it's not discriminatory that they're excluding your child. So they're not excluding your child for reasons related to their disability, or because the support wasn't in place that would stop them being excluded. So they have to be very cautionary that they're taking into account your child's needs, and they're making sure that that exclusion isn't discriminatory. We can probably talk a bit more about that as we get into some examples and talk through what that might look like and what you can do there. But there's a few different steps you can take if you do feel or have concerns that your child might be treated unfairly. that's probably the main things, and it looks like we've probably got a lot of questions already come in there. So I don't know, Beth, if you want to start with our FAQs, or there's anything you want to say before we get into them?
Yeah, I think we could get going. I think if you go on to the next slide, because actually a lot of people have asked sort of variations on this question. Unfortunately, a lot of people seem to be struggling with something similar. Lots of people saying, my son or daughter, my child is struggling to attend school. They've not been attending for ages. They've not been attending for weeks or years. What should we do about it? We don't know how to get them back into school. We're trying to work with the school to sort stuff out, but it's not going very well. So shall I answer this one, Hannah?
Yeah, is that okay? Yes.
Lots of talking. Yeah. So hopefully Hannah's answered a lot of your questions about this already. But as we've said, if your child is struggling to attend school, it's important to remember that they've still got a right to an education, and they've still got that right to support that meets their needs as well. If your child's at a local authority school, what that means is that the local authority is responsible for their education and support. So if they're not able to attend school, those rights still apply. The local authority is still responsible, and they should be finding a way as best they can to provide them with some kind of an education. Lots of different ways that can happen. One of the biggest things to talk about is obviously trying to get your child back into school, and whatever that takes to do that, whatever extra support they need, whatever circumstances it might be. And that's obviously the big part of the conversation. The other part of the conversation is that while they're not at school, what are we going to do? What support are they going to get? What learning are they going to get while they're not able to attend? And for whatever reason it is that they can't attend. Lots of different things that schools and local authorities can do to support that education. As we saw through COVID now, there's a whole wealth of online learning that's available to a lot of people. If that's not possible or that's not appropriate for your child, you're within your rights to ask what alternatives there might be. Could they go to an alternative provision and learn there, like a different setting? Are there people in your local authority that do sort of outreach classes that they could go somewhere, or that could come and visit you? Ultimately, you can put it to the local authority. If your child's at a local authority school, the local authority have got that duty. So you can obviously suggest things because you know your child and what might work for them, but you can also put it to them and say, what are you going to do? You've got this duty. How can you meet their needs? If you've tried online learning and it's not worked, why hasn't it worked? Having those conversations and trying to find something that will work for your child and their circumstances. And then, like I say, also building in that return to school planning, that structure, like the part-time timetable might work as a short-term solution, building up that time back in school, or it might be that they need to look at alternative settings for your child to go to where they'll feel more comfortable or more able to learn while they're there. Hopefully that answers that one.
I think that's great. Yeah, great.
To add, Hannah?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I noticed there was a few kind of coming in as well about young people who've been who may be off, and I know someone's mentioned about kind of long COVID and things for their young person, and I think as Beth probably already mentioned, and as I kind of mentioned before, the law doesn't say exactly what support will look like, for children who are struggling to attend school. What it says is that it should be appropriate and should have kind of long-term. I think they should receive. Sorry, my computer's just having a moment. Should support. So what the guidance says is the education a child who's out of school receives should be support a broad, flexible curriculum that builds on their existing learning. So I know that's quite broad and can feel a bit frustrating that I can't say that, yes, your child's entitled to 4 or 5 hours of this type of education every day, or a tutor that amount. But if you feel your child is not being offered that broad, flexible curriculum, something that's appropriate, that can build on their learning, and they are capable of doing more, one of the kind of key steps around that is, so first going back and talking to the the school about what is the plan for the support for your child, how did they feel it meets your child's individual needs, what's your child experiencing, how do they feel it meets their needs, and if you're not satisfied with that offer, you can escalate that to the local authority if you haven't spoken to them before, and talk about, is there further options around finding something that meets your child's needs. And beyond that, there is further steps you can take in the kind of working together and escalating section of our website. If you feel that there is not an offer that meets your child's needs and is not enough for them, then you can take steps like going to the local authority, and ones above that like mediation, and kind of a formal complaints route that you could go about. I hope that is helpful to that answer. I think, yeah, a few people would ask about whether that be the Additional Support Needs Tribunal. It depends a little bit on your next steps. So I think Mohit can probably share, there's kind of a bit in our website that sets out your further steps that you can take. There's particular cases that can go to the tribunal that you can have a look there. But there might be some ones like mediation and complaints that you could try before that, or what's called independent adjudication. I think our next one is...
Yeah, I've got another question if you're ready for it, Hannah.
Yep, that sounds fine.
So we've had a couple of questions, again, on a sort of similar theme. People saying that their child is refusing to go to school because of the situation at school, whether that's sort of the sensory environment of being in a mainstream school. A couple of people mentioned sort of bullying, that social side of things is stopping their child from wanting to be at school. What can you do about that if it is the school environment that's the reason why your child's not wanting to attend?
Yeah, that sounds like a really difficult situation for that family, and is certainly something that we hear. So there are kind of various things. So school environment in itself and the learning environment can, is part of children's additional support needs and their experience. So, there's the first things around having that conversation. It might be things that you've already have about, is there adaptations that can be made in the school environment or the way that your child is accessing that school that can reduce anxiety? Is there kind of things that can do to help with the transition into school, or getting in the door around that? Is there safe spaces and places they can talk to? If it is that your feeling is that there isn't an appropriate way for your child to be able to access that school, that there's just something kind of inherent in that environment that's not going to work for them, that's when it can be worth having conversations with the local authority and possibly your child's educational psychologist, if they have one, or requesting a referral from one about, is there a more appropriate school for your child? So there is a presumption of mainstreaming in Scottish education, which means that most children should be offered an education and support that meets their needs in the mainstream school and within their local school environment. But if it's agreed that that environment can't meet your child's aptitude or ability, then other schools can be looked at and other provisions. So we've got a fact sheet on school placement that covers quite a lot around that. So it can normally start with kind of having quite a big review conversation with the school and possibly the local authority about, is there any other way to meet your child's needs in this school, and what's your child's view of that? And if not, what else could be offered at a different provision? And then there is options around placing requests and routes like that you could go down if you didn't feel that. So there's quite a lot, normally we'd suggest going back to the school and starting with that basis and talking about planning and about the whole journey of that. So what's the ins, what support could be provided at school to get back into school. And I think, Cian, I've seen in a few questions already that I don't think I fully mentioned, was that if your child's not able to attend, how are they learning when they're at home as well? Yep.
Great, thanks, Hannah.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that covered it really well. Got another question here that I will answer. There's a couple of people saying that, sort of linked to that, they know that the school environment that they're in isn't working, the mainstream sort of setting isn't appropriate for them, or the school that they're at is saying that they're not able to meet their child's needs. So what do they do about it? A couple of people, or at least one person, has said that their school aren't pursuing other settings for them. So what can they do? So I suppose the first thing to say is that Like I said, the local authority's got that duty to provide your child with an education if they're at a local authority school. If the school that they're at doesn't feel able to meet their needs, there's a couple of things you can do. So the first thing you can do is talk to the school about what the alternatives are. Are there other settings nearby? Are there other places that would be better suited? Whether that's a different mainstream school that's maybe a bit smaller or in a different location, or if it's a support unit or a specialist unit that specializes in additional needs, or some units specialize in particular conditions specifically, or if it's a special school itself. So you can talk to the current school about that and what those options are. The school should be able to sort of put you through with the local authority and help you with that process of looking at alternatives. If the school doesn't agree with you and they think actually mainstream is fine, that's a conversation to have. But if you don't agree with them, you can then put in a placing request. As Hannah said, there's a whole fact sheet. We've got our school placements fact sheet, and in there is an explanation of that process. But basically what a placing request is you saying, I want my child to go to this school, and you have to name a specific school. You say, I want them to go here. The local authority reviews that application, and depending on the outcome, they will either be accepted and they'll get a place at that school, or it'll be rejected. And there's different sort of appeals processes depending where you've applied to. But yeah, it's certainly a conversation that can be had with the local authority. Hopefully the school will be able to talk you through that. If you're having difficulty with the school, then you can just talk to your local authority directly, ask them for information, or put in that placing request if you think that's the best option for your child.
Certainly. And just to add on this, on that situation, there's a few people asking about they've been through an internal placing request process. So they put in a placing request to, they've been requested a placement via an internal system rather than the parental placing request system. We do actually have, I know there's a few questions coming around our placements. We've recently done a school placement webinar. There's quite a lot around school placements, so it's worth having a look at that webinar and our fact sheet on school placements. That explains the options if you've not put in a parental placing request. But what you've done is maybe supported an application that's come through the council. You can, there is sometimes internal ways to appeal that, but there is also, you can also then put in a parental placing request. I noticed there been quite a few around exclusion come up. I also know there's a few questions that are around independent schools and whether some of these duties apply there. So I don't know if we want to move on to exclusion, or there was any you particularly wanted to pick out, Beth.
The only last thing that I've noticed sort of running through a couple of questions is a couple of people have asked, could I just remove my child from school for 6 months or for a period of time, remove them from the school role, and then get back involved with the local authority schools after like a rest period or a break from what is understandably a really stressful situation. I don't know if you want to answer that, or I can.
Yes, absolutely. So I think this is a really difficult situation you can end up in where you know, it feels like things are not working for your child and you're, you know, understandably looking for another solution. I suppose that what that comes down to is you're requesting to request to home educate would be the route. If you want your child, the local authority, to no longer be responsible for your child's education and you're not expected to send them into school, you would need to apply to home educate. And that's certainly, you know, that's a positive decision that families make. The important thing I should say is that should be a positive choice. You know, if you would like your local authority, the council, to be responsible for your child's education, then it shouldn't be that you have to pull them out of school in order for you to find the right support for them, unless that's what you want to do. I know the reality is that it can be really difficult, and that some families look at that. The important thing is if you were to do that, to request home educate, you would then need to firstly be explaining how else you're going to educate your child. And there is support, and we have a kind of fact sheet that explains about that if you did want to go down that route. But I suppose the other thing is, if the reality is that you don't actually want to be home educating, but you feel like you're in that situation where it feels like the only option, I'd really be encouraging you to go and speak to the school and the local authority and setting out this current plan is not working for my child, and I'm concerned about that support, because if your child, it's agreed that your child's needs can't be met, they can't be in there full time, or this isn't working, then really it should be about the school and local authority working with you to come up with a solution. And that could be, a temporary part-time placement, if it was agreed that it wasn't full-time wouldn't work for them at the moment, but really it should be about coming to that agreement together, or looking at those other solutions. So it's certainly worth, if you're reaching that point, to be raising that kind of further up the system, saying this isn't working, and seeing if there's an agreement before you feel that you have to take them out of school, because ideally your child has that right, and a flexible placement or some way to meet that need should be able to be found.
Yeah, it's also probably worth noting, if you remove your child from the school role and the local authority is no longer responsible for them, what that means is that additional support for learning legislation then wouldn't apply to your child. If children are educated by the local authority, then the Additional Support for Learning Act and all that legislation and guidance has to take place for them. They have that right to support. If your child isn't at a local authority school, or if they're not being educated by the local authority, I should say, then those rights no longer apply. Your local area can decide that they will still help, and there are homeschooling organisations and support groups and things like that that can offer that kind of support. But in terms of the local authority's duty to support you, if your child isn't enrolled, then the local authority doesn't have that duty, because what you're saying is, I'm going to take that responsibility for my child's education. So definitely worth thinking about. And as Hannah said, if that's the point that you're reaching, it is worth pursuing those next steps, talking to the local authority, and then there are those further steps you can take, mediation and putting in complaints and following it up the chain that way. We've got a fact sheet called Avoiding and Solving Problems, and that sets out in an order what you should do. So it starts with talking to the school, then it goes to talking to the local authority, and it goes through all the different options that you've got. So if you are in a position where you need to escalate it that far, then there are ways that you can do that, and hopefully you'll find some sort of solution that works for you.
On that as well, I think that, kind of following on from Beth, you can return your child so you could take your child out of school and then return them to school. So basically get back in touch with the local authority and say, I want you to be responsible for my child's education again. And that is an option. I suppose, the key things, it wouldn't necessarily change, what's being offered for your child when you go back to them. So, but, you can at any point kind of return to the local authority and say, I want you to be responsible for my child's education again. The only time when that's difficult is if they're over 16 and the kind of inherent duty for them to be responsible for your child's education ends. On that subject, I know there's a few questions that have come in around independent schooling, and was kind of just covered by what Beth said in terms of the Additional Support for Learning Act. So those duties to identify your child's needs and offer them adequate and efficient education and support, those don't apply if your child is at an independent school, because the local authority isn't responsible for their education. Those around attendance and exclusion, if your child's at an independent school, they're still covered by the Equality Act. So the duties around making sure that child's not disadvantaged or treated unfairly still apply. And I know those questions are around exclusion, so we'll get a bit onto them as well. But it's quite important to be aware that the Additional Support for Learning Act doesn't specifically apply to independent schools, but we do have a fact sheet on independent schooling that might be quite useful to look at. And often local authority, independent schools will follow a lot of the same guidance and ethos of the what's out there around additional support for learning and around exclusions, and will have their own policies that you can follow up on. Great. I know we've already covered it. I was wondering, Beth, would you be able to talk a little bit about flexi schooling, and then maybe we can move on to exclusions?
Yeah, sure. So flexi schooling, for anyone who's not sure about it, is a situation where the duty to provide education would be shared between a local authority school, or I suppose an independent school as well, and the parents or the other people that the child lives with. It's quite a strange thing. There's not really anything specific in legislation about how that should work. I know it's something that's being discussed actually as part of a review of some of the guidance at the moment. But as it stands just now, there isn't a sort of specific setup for how it should work. So it's a conversation that would be had sort of with your local authority specifically, or with your child's school, to talk about how that would work for your child in that individual circumstance. The reason it's a bit complicated is because you're deciding to share the responsibility for education, where most of the time a child is either educated by the local authority or they're educated at home or by an independent school that are separate. But doing the flexi schooling would be a combination. And it would just be a conversation, I suppose, about who's going to be responsible for what duties you're both going to take on, and how that's going to work. It is something we do hear about as happening and working for some people. But like we say, the guidance is kind of weird about it. It's not anything specific. So in terms of advice about it, it would just be that it's a conversation to have with your local authority and get something in place if you wanted. And we would probably suggest getting that in writing just to confirm how it's all going to work. But yeah, it is something that we've heard works for some people. So if it's something you're considering, there's certainly no harm asking and having those conversations.
Yeah, certainly. I think it's just, one of those things. There's not an explicit right in the law for flexi schooling. And I suppose the other thing that's important about it is it should be because you would like to flexi school, so share that responsibility between home and the local authority. If the agreement is actually that your child, and this will be in a very rare case, because most children, your child has a right to be in school full time, and there should be support in place to allow for that. But in the occasion where it's agreed that your child cannot cope with full-time education, and the agreement is that they're not able to either full-time education or they cannot cope with full-time in the school setting, then that's an additional support need, and it shouldn't be that you have to apply to flexi school in order for your child to get that reasonable adjustment or additional support in order for them to not be in school full time. If everyone's in agreement, that's what your child requires, then that shouldn't really require your child to flexi school, because it should be that everyone's in agreement. And it might be that needs to be written into a plan so that we can all agree that's where we are at the moment for your child, but that shouldn't require you to flexi school. I think that just kind of adds, there's a question that I've seen come in around a parent feeling that their child really can't cope with full-time education, but the school are very focused on constantly progressing their child on with that goal of full-time education, and wanting to extend the day. That is something we sometimes hear about, because it's kind of that other side of, that really part-time timetables should only be used in the short term, and the school and local authority should be trying to find a way to offer your child as much education as their peers, so that they can benefit fully from their education. But again, if you feel that your child cannot cope with that kind of full school day, or at the moment it just seems very far away that they're going to be able to attend full time, then it's probably worth kind of going to the school and saying, this is my understanding of my child's needs, this is the view I'm coming from, asking the school about the view that they come from, that they do feel your child can cope with full time, involving other professionals if that's needed, or kind of further up the local authority if you can't agree that way forwards. And there are kind of other steps like mediation if it was to continue to be that school said absolutely your child needs to be in full time and you didn't agree with that. But really the focus down on, if you're feeling that, is what's my understanding of my child's needs. This feels my understanding of my child's needs, speaking to the school about what their view is, seeing if there is a kind of joint understanding that can become to around what feels right for your child at the moment. But if not, kind of taking further steps and kind of raising that further up and getting some other professionals involved. Do we want to move on to exclusions maybe, Beth?
Yeah, there's been a couple of questions about, my child's been excluded and they weren't provided with any education while they were off, but should they have been? The answer is yes, they should have been. Just a short, quick one, but yes, if your child's been excluded, that doesn't mean they lose the right to an education. If it's a very short-term exclusion, things might not get put in place for a day or two. If it's going to be a longer-term exclusion, then they certainly should have some sort of education provided while they're off, whether that's just work sent home or online learning or access to a different sort of learning setting. But yeah, if your child is excluded, no matter what the reason, they should still be accessing some kind of education for the time that they're not going to be at school.
Absolutely. And that should kind of inform conversations about, even maybe before your child is excluded, about the impact the exclusion is going to have on them and how they're going to access their education while they're there. You know, what that's going to look like and how it's going to impact them. I think just kind of leading on from that, I know there's quite a few questions come up about kind of regular exclusions, and I think part of that is always about the fact that if your child's being excluded, it's quite a strong sign that the right support might not be in place for them. And really, if an exclusion is being used, then is it an opportunity for a reset and for a conversation that reviews your child's plan? And what, you know, really that conversation being, if your child has been excluded, something's gone very wrong and something's not working for your child, they're distressed, you know, things aren't working. So what can we sit down together to have a conversation about what's going to change and what more or different support can be offered to get them back into school, and also to help them possibly recover from the impact of that exclusion, which may have been difficult on everyone involved in that, and to rebuild that trust around it. And really, if regular exclusions are happening, it's a real sign that, you know, something needs to change, and conversations need to be had at school level that you and your child can be involved with, and planning meetings. And if the school are still struggling, do they need to seek more advice? Do they need to review the placement? What other support can be provided?
Yeah, I think that applies to exclusions and to sort of difficulties with attendance. One of the things we advise quite often on our helpline is to go back to that focus on what your child's needs are. What is it specifically that they're looking for support with, and thinking about, you know, the GERFEC, getting it right for every child. Setup of the curriculum is designed to support not only academic learning, but social and emotional support as well. So what is it that's causing difficulties? What specifically are the points of issue, either that's causing exclusion or that's causing your child to not want to be at school? And what steps can the school take, or what support can they put in place to help to resolve those concerns or support them through that thing that they're having difficulty with?
Certainly, yeah. And I'm just having a wee look to see what other questions we've had around exclusion. Thanks, Beth. I suppose the other thing is, I think there's a few people saying that I'm sure I saw a question around that they hadn't been given an appeals letter and they haven't been getting kind of formal exclusions. And I think we kind of cover that a bit further. We had kind of a question around that, and it's something we hear about on the helpline, which is around being asked to either pick your child up regularly or being called in because someone's saying that, you know, your child's struggling, is distressed, can you maybe pop and take them home for a bit? And that kind of ties into, I've already mentioned, around unlawful exclusions. I don't know if you want to explain a bit more about what families can do in that circumstance, Beth.
Yeah, definitely. So as Hannah explained earlier, there are sort of very specific rules for when a child can be excluded, and it's important that your school is meeting those rules, and they can't just exclude on any other grounds. They certainly can't ask your child to leave school without that being some kind of an exclusion. So if the child is being removed from school, that is an exclusion, and they need to frame it in that way, and they need to follow the procedures that come with that. If it's, like Hannah said, something to do with, you know, the questions once they've been excluded is about what are the reasons for that, and there are sort of timescales for when those conversations need to be had following the exclusion. You should be meeting with the school quite soon after to discuss what happened and how you can move forward, and what steps you can put in place to stop it from needing to happen again, whether that's extra support at school, or, you know, what is it that caused the exclusion in the first place, and how can we prevent that from happening again? Hannah, do you know the timescales for those off the top of my head?
Oh, for the different parts of the exclusion.
Yeah.
So within a day, the local authority should, the school should get in touch with you, and then within 7 days they should arrange a meeting, and within 8 days they should write to you setting out the the reasons for that exclusion and that grounds, and your right to appeal around that. So there's really set, which is part of why it can feel a bit of an escalation. But if you are being asked, you know, to regularly pick your child up, asking, is this an exclusion, and for a copy of the child's the school's exclusion policy can be quite helpful, because the important thing is schools have to report on exclusions. There is that right of appeal. So, you know, actually having a conversation about what this is and, you know, why we're using it regularly. You know, sending your child home as a way to manage their support needs is a sign that the support might not be working. And, you know, regular exclusions, all of this could be a sign that your child's being treated unfairly, or at least there needs to be a conversation about, are you treating my child fairly? Are these kind of consequences as a result of their disability? On that, there's a question that someone's asked about the rules on exclusions and early pickups being the same for nursery provision. Yes, I'm pretty sure. Yes, I'm just double checking with you, Beth. I can't see any reason why it'd be any different.
Yeah, as far as I know.
Yeah. If your child is getting their funded hours, then the additional support for learning laws apply, and that's kind of part of their education. So kind of in all of what we've been discussing, when we talk about your school's duties, it applies the same to nursery. So, you know, if you're regularly being asked to pick your child up from nursery, then you can ask, are they being excluded? And also it just triggers exactly the same conversations around what, you know, what's not work, you know, something's not working, how can we support your child? And your child has a right to their nursery hours. So again, you can be questioning if that's an exclusion and appeal it. I just noticed we've got another question saying, do the exclusion regulations apply to an alternative to exclusion? Not quite.
I think I read a previous question, and I think that's where the schools say something like, we're not going to send your child home, but we're going to put them in a different classroom, or they're going to be in a support base, or they're going to be out from where they normally are for a day or two, or whatever length of time. Would that be considered an exclusion?
So not kind of for the laws around exclusion apply specifically to sort of, it's defined as when you are asked to, there's a removal and your child is unable to attend school, then that would be, my understanding would be, that would be the law for exclusion. But if your child is, I suppose it's about conversation, you know, if it's an alternative to exclusion, that is part of the conversation that's coming up around how exclusion being a last resort. I'm imagining in that situation is, what else can we do to support your child? But I suppose the key thing is, if they're looking consistently at alternatives to exclusion, there's still a sign that, you know, things are escalating for your child and things are not working to a point where maybe there needs to be a review of what supports in place. And you can certainly be questioning, you know, is that working for a child? Are they being treated fairly? And if they are getting moved out of their regular class, how are they still getting their offer of education? You know, if a child's regularly being put somewhere else and not in where they are usually planning on being educated, are they still getting the support to learn and fulfill their potential there? So although it maybe doesn't give you quite the same formal routes as the exclusion procedure, you know, it's still flagging that something is escalating in behaviour or something else about that situation that means your child's needs need to be reviewed, and there needs to be a conversation about, you know, if they're having to do something that's sort of a trigger from crisis regularly, and what's causing that crisis. And a lot of conversations about kind of exclusions, you know, should be maybe having conversations about triggers around strengths, what supports your child, and them being involved in that to avoid getting to that situation where we're talking about exclusion or something that's like exclusion.
Yeah, definitely. It fits within that, you know, that wider idea of like social and emotional learning that's part of the curriculum. So if they're not given those social opportunities, or if they're struggling with their emotional regulation or their behavior in class, that's a support need, and the school should be helping you to work out the best way to support that, so that you don't need to, you know, they don't need to be sitting outside the classroom or being excluded, or like Hannah said, it's avoiding that point of escalation in the first place and trying to get to a healthier working learning environment for your child.
Yeah. And I think like the two questions that just come up are hopefully quite covered by that as well, which is you know, if the first one was saying if you're asked to pick up your child and it's never called an exclusion by the school, does this still sit under unlawful exclusion? And yet that would be kind of exactly what we mean by unlawful exclusion. You know, if they're not telling, you know, if you're being asked to take your child out of school and it's not for a reason that, you know, they're physically unwell or there's a set reason, then that's exactly if it's not being called an exclusion. But everything on the tin says it's an exclusion, then that's where we call an unlawful exclusion. If the school are saying it's for a child's safety, you know, so firstly, one of the reasons around that can be possibly a ground for exclusion, but also, you know, if the school are saying they can't keep your child safe, then there really needs to be a really clear review of their support, because that is a sign that, you know, the right support isn't in place and they can't keep your child safe. So that should be requiring them to review and possibly speak to the local authority or review the support altogether if they are basically needing to exclude your child in order to keep them safe. What that is a sign is that support should be reviewed. So you can certainly go back to the school with that and be having a conversation about is this exclusion, and you know, and you're understanding that it appears to be exclusion, and what steps are being taken to avoid that unlawful exclusion.
Cool. I've got another question here, and that kind of applies to both attendance issues and exclusion. We've mentioned a couple of times those formal next steps. If you've tried talking to the school, what do you do if that's not working? What are the next steps that you can take? I won't go into loads of detail about all of the things that you can do. There's a lot of processes that are there if you need them. But the first thing to say is that obviously we recommend trying to sort things out with the school. They know your child in the situation, and hopefully if you can facilitate those conversations, then that's the best place to do it. We understand obviously it's not always that simple. Sometimes relationships break down and you need to look for more support somewhere else or at that next, you know, the higher level. So beyond the school, the next step would be your local authority. On our website, we actually have a list of the additional support for learning contacts that we have for every local authority. We would recommend getting in touch with them if you do have concerns that haven't been able to be resolved with the school. They should be able to get back in touch with you and hopefully help to resolve that situation. But following that, there are more steps that you can do. You can do things like formal complaints to the local authority and pursuing that sort of more formal legal route, I suppose is the word for it. On the other end of the spectrum, I suppose, is a mediation, which is where a neutral third party can sit with you on the school or with you and the local authority and kind of facilitate more of a conversation, a discussion about what you're concerned about, what difficulties the school are facing. And a mediation can be a great way of sort of getting the air cleared and coming to an agreement together. So that those would be the two sort of next steps. Beyond that, there's even further things that you can do. Our avoiding and solving problems fact sheet lists them all in order with way more detail than we'd be able to go in just now. So if that's something that you are looking at pursuing, there are definitely things that you can do. Someone's just asked there about mediation being supplied by the local authority. Mediation's always independent. Legally, it has to be. By law, it always is. Sometimes it is the case that, well, what tends to happen is that mediation services are funded by local authorities, but local authorities themselves don't have any sway or jurisdiction over the mediation service themselves. Local authorities have got a duty to have a mediation service, so they have to provide one. But the way that the mediation service runs is entirely independent from the local authority. You'll actually find the biggest one that works with most local authorities is Resolve. So they work across a lot of different places in Scotland, but every local authority will have one, even if they're sort of funded, if you like, by the local authority. They're run entirely independently because they should be, but also legally because they have to be.
Yeah. So yeah, and that's important. There are some local authorities, so the bigger ones are Resolve and Common Ground. Some local authorities, you do have to get in touch through the council to get to the mediation provider. So you can just you can basically write to them and request, I would like independent mediation. But the important thing is that that mediation, as Beth said, although it's funded by the local authority, it's their legal duty to fund independent mediation, so it will always be independent. I've noticed also we've had quite a few questions come in which are kind of similar about the use of kind of seclusion, or kind of your child being moved outside of the classroom, so they're not being excluded anymore. I know someone was mentioning that's as a result of their complaint, their child isn't being excluded, but they're still being asked to, they're being moved out of the classroom, or children in the class are being moved out. These are all kind of different forms of seclusion in some sense. And again, seclusion, kind of removing your child from the learning environment, is again something that is quite a serious thing to do, and is quite a serious step to take. So the local authority, the school, should be looking at that as something, you know, something is not working so well for your child, and it's quite an extreme form of kind of intervention that they're using. It's not the same as exclusion, so it doesn't have the same kind of regulations apply to it, and kind of restrictions. But again, it's the conversation there should be about, well, you know, if your child is sitting outside the classroom, how are they still getting their access to their learning? How are they being included still? How are they still getting the support that they're required to develop in their social and emotional and academic skills? How are they building up with their peers? So again, it might be used in some situations as a short-term solution, or not even as a solution, but if it's part of a plan. But again, it shouldn't be used as a kind of long-term way of consistently managing your child's needs, or at least it should be kind of reviewed with yourselves and your children to see what they're going to do next, and how else they can get your child engaged in that classroom, or not being removed from that. And if they are regularly using that, it should be a conversation that they're having with the kind of with yourselves and the educational psychologist or other professionals around how that can be reduced, and your child be included and engaged and involved in their education offer again. Is there any more? I know I'm just looking at time. We were meant to be an hour, but I know we were running about 15 minutes late, but I think we've nearly got to the end. Is there any particular ones you want to pick up, Beth, before we wrap up?
I think we've covered all the things that we'd aimed to. I hope that most people, we managed to answer a question. If it wasn't yours exactly, that it was something similar. If we didn't get to your question, or if you've got something more specific that you want to ask us about, obviously you're welcome to get in touch with our helpline. So Hannah's just put all the stuff up on there, so you can give us a call. We're open 9:30 till 4:30, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. So you're welcome to give us a call, talk to either me or Hannah, or one of our other advisors will be on the phone to speak to you. We've also got the website, so we've got loads of information on there. Mohit's shared quite a lot of links to things already, but there's loads more stuff on there, and it's all new and lovely, so you should go and have a look anyway. You can also send us an email directly if you'd rather, and then we've got Facebook and Twitter, and we also have a parents guide. So if you wanted either an online version or a print version of our parents guide that covers a little bit of everything that you might possibly need to know, you are welcome to order one of those on the link that's on there as well.